The snow didn't fall on Solstice Outpost. It screamed. Thin needles of frozen carbon dioxide ripped across the tundra at over 200 kilometers per hour, carried by Saturn's jet stream winds. The station was built to withstand it. Human engineering could endure more than the universe believed. At least, until the Zevran came. They didn't knock. They landed. The shock wave cracked half the dome's supports. The second pulse shattered the rest. Within minutes, power failed, oxygen systems collapsed, and the heating grid died. 10 minutes later, 90% of the station's inhabitants were dead. Not from the attack, from exposure. Saturn's moon Enceladus was unforgiving even when things were going well. Now, with the atmosphere sucked out and the shelters caved in, it became a graveyard painted in frost and silence. Except for one section. Sector B9, the substructure. Buried beneath 60 meters of reinforced basalt and insulated rock, it held. Barely. Lights flickered, oxygen was thin, and temperatures hovered just above freezing. But inside, there were survivors, and one of them was a janitor named Elias Vorn. Elias wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for war, or survival tactics, or emergency medical care. He cleaned the waste processors on rotation, maintained the scrubbers, replaced broken tiles. He was the invisible man of Solstice Station, and now he was the only one still standing. The last alert had flashed across the console 5 minutes before the external feeds died. Contact, unknown vessel. Atmospheric entry. Surface displacement detected. Then came structural breach. Main dome integrity compromised. And then silence. Elias stood in the dark, gripping a cracked comm unit that no longer functioned. Around him were 6 others. 2 engineers. 1 hydroponic tech. A geologist. A med officer. And a child, barely 9 years old, tucked into a pressure suit too large for her. Stay calm, the med officer whispered. They're probably gone now. But Elias didn't believe it, because he'd seen the ship. Just before the feed cut out, before the cameras failed, he caught a glimpse of it through a flickering lens. It was tall, angular, blacker than the void itself. No lights, no engines visible. It simply hovered above the station like an executioner's blade, and it was quiet. Too quiet. The Zevran didn't make noise when they landed. They didn't need to. They came when they were certain they wouldn't need a second shot. That was their mistake. The first week was chaos. The survivors stayed low, rationed air, cycled emergency power from the geothermal backup core, and waited. No help came. Earth was 34 minutes away by FTL relay. Mars closer, but still too far to matter. And deep space channels had gone dead, whether due to interference, sabotage, or annihilation, no one knew. The child's name was Lyra. She had frostbite in 2 fingers. Elias carried her through the tunnels. When her legs gave out, he shared his heat suit with her, gave up his thermal gloves. Every time he looked at her face, pale and blank with hunger, something shifted in him. He wasn't a soldier, but he was human, and humans didn't die easy. By day 12, the engineers found a way to bypass the broken geothermal conduits. A slow trickle of heat returned, not enough to thaw the walls, but enough to keep the cold from seizing their lungs while they slept. The geologist, Rena, tried to make contact through a makeshift array using old mining sensors. Nothing. The Zevran had flooded the spectrum. The med officer died on day 15. Heart failure. The stress, the cold, the silence. It wore on all of them. Elias buried her near the old access shaft, where the outer walls had thickest insulation. There was no ceremony, only breath fogging in the air, and the sound of ice shifting beneath their boots. Then, on day 22, they heard the sound. A faint, rhythmic vibration through the floor. Metallic, measured, footsteps. Rena froze. They found us. No, said Elias. They're checking, making sure no one's left. They think we're done. So we're dead. No, Elias stood slowly. We're going to show them they're wrong. It started with the scrubbers. Elias rerouted the carbon filters to mask their biosigns, mimicking a reactor heat leak. The engineers helped reinforce the tunnel ceiling to collapse on command. They built a trap. Nothing fancy. Just old mining tools, pressure valves, and a steel beam rigged to slam shut like a guillotine. The child slept in the crawlspace behind the water tanks. Safe, warm, hidden. Elias watched the hull from the vent slit with the steel rod in hand. They weren't trained, but they were furious. The Zevran scout entered on day 24. 7 feet tall, insectoid, covered in black carapace and shimmerfield armor that bent light around its edges. It didn't expect resistance. It stepped forward, scanning the wall, when the ceiling gave way. The beam struck its back, pinning it to the floor. Rena surged forward with a mining torch. Elias slammed the steel rod down again and again until the carapace cracked and green fluid sprayed the floor. The alien twitched once, then went still. Elias stared down at the corpse. He didn't cheer. He didn't speak. He just whispered, "Told you, we don't die easy." That was the beginning. They had one kill. One. But it meant the Zevran weren't invincible. And more importantly, it meant humans could adapt. They had no military support, no warships, no weapons, only endurance. And that endurance was now a weapon. The Zevran believed the humans on Enceladus were an anomaly. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either, because anomalies, by their nature, spread. Orbital Station K9, once a sleepy scientific platform above the asteroid Vesta, had received a warning ping from Solstice Outpost before the signal went dead. A garbled message, only half legible. Don't trust readings. Zevran masking tech. They come cold, silent. Expect death. Chief Tech Officer Marin Koo ignored evacuation protocol. Instead, she rewired the orbital maintenance drones. They weren't weapons, just welding bots and cargo arms. But Marin knew something the Zevran didn't. A tool in the hands of someone desperate enough becomes a weapon. When the first Zevran boarding team breached the docking ring, they found a station with no life signs. They stepped in. The floor gave out, and they fell into a cargo bay rigged with 15 drones, holding tungsten rods sharpened to hypersonic points. Marin didn't even watch. She waited, listened. When the floor rumbled and the station lights dimmed, she pressed the charge button. She waited 6 minutes before opening the door. What was left of the Zevran was smeared. She left it there. A reminder. 3 jumps away, on Ceres Mining Base Alpha, a group of trapped engineers had no oxygen tanks, no weapons, no way out. So they boiled their own coolant to mask heat signatures and rigged the transport sleds to crash into Zevran patrols with spiked payloads of ore shards. They called it Operation Needlestorm. It worked. Of the 7 engineers, only 2 survived. But the Zevran didn't stay. They avoided Ceres after that. Too costly, too strange, too unpredictable. The endurance wasn't just in fighting. It was in surviving everything the Zevran couldn't imagine enduring. They were a race of precision, logic, calculated force. But they underestimated what raw refusal to die could do. Humans fought with hunger, with frostbite, with vacuum burns. They fought through fear. In the abandoned refueling ring over Europa, a single maintenance worker named Halim Farouk remained behind after his crew left. The shuttle couldn't carry all 8 of them. He stayed by choice. He rigged the platform's comms tower into a high-gain pulse array, and for 32 days, he sent one message into deep space every hour. We are not gone. We are not done. We do not kneel. He survived off algae protein and recycled water. By day 30, his fingers had necrotized from frostbite. He taped a stylus to his wrist and kept transmitting. The Zevran came for him on day 33. They found the ring empty, the airlocks blown, the entire control panel coated in blood, but the message was still playing. On loop. We do not kneel. We do not kneel. We do not kneel. The Zevran couldn't compute it. Their entire conquest model was built on suppression curves. Every previous species had fallen in stages. 1 shock, 2 resistance, 3 collapse, 4 assimilation. But humanity looped. Shock led to resistance. Resistance led to adaptation. And collapse. It never came. Because humans didn't understand when to stop. On Mars, the Red Rift Resistance was born in a mining shaft 2 kilometers below the Olympus Mons colony ruins. They didn't fight the Zevran directly. They recorded them, cataloged their biology, noted their weaknesses, discovered that their cold armor shattered under harmonic frequency attacks. So they turned mining drills into sonic lances. Every time the Zevran scanned for heat, they found nothing, until a sudden screech, a vibrational spike, hit them in the skull at 38,000 hertz. The screams didn't last long. The humans wore sealed suits with counterfilters. The Zevran bled from their ear canals and collapsed. The Red Rift buried them in rock, then moved deeper. They didn't just want to win. They wanted to understand the enemy. Humans started learning Zevran body language, intercepting gestures and neural pulses. On Titan, they mimicked them, used them against the invaders. A small scout group made a Zevran patrol believe it had received a recall order. When it left its post, the human cell disabled their atmospheric station with a pipe wrench and a blowtorch. When the patrol returned, its own superiors executed it for cowardice. The humans watched from the ice shelf and said nothing. The next time the Zevran passed, they didn't return at all. Elias Vorn and the Solstice survivors were no longer alone. Across moons, belts, orbitals, and debris rings, humanity had gone feral. No one led them. No one needed to. They weren't following orders. They were following instinct. The instinct to crawl, to bleed, to fight, to survive. And slowly, cracks began to form in the Zevran's approach. Their conquest fleet stopped progressing. Reports flooded back to their command nexus, losses, confusion, anomalies. A fleet commander submitted a single-line report. Species response patterns inconsistent. Disrupts prediction models. Another wrote, resistance intensity rising despite infrastructure collapse. Recommend reassessment. But by then, it was too late. Because humans weren't just enduring. They were innovating. In a dark orbital junkyard above Neptune's dead relay station, 6 kids who had once played hide-and-seek among old satellites pieced together a gravity scrambler from a broken FTL coil and a Zevran drone core. They didn't know how it worked. They only knew that when it pulsed, Zevran ships tilted off course like drunkards in a storm. They started calling themselves the Static Wolves. Their motto, we may not breathe long, but we bite deep. Elias heard the first stories through a recovered data packet pulled from a recon probe they rigged on Enceladus. He read the message in a cold tunnel lit by solar lamps and whispered, they're still fighting. He looked at the little girl, Lyra, now 3 weeks stronger, face no longer hollow. He smiled. We're not done. The Zevran had conquered planets, but they had never met a species that could live without them, that could fight without winning, that could lose everything, and still find the strength to crawl toward a new trap, a new fight, a new day, that could outlast extinction. By the time Zevran High Command authorized psychological sterilization protocols, code black annihilation orders, their ships had already begun failing to return, and the whispers across human systems grew stronger. We're still here. We don't kneel. We don't break. By the time the Zevran realized what was happening, it was already too late. They had underestimated human endurance. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming endurance was only about survival. They never expected that we would turn pain into strategy, that we would evolve our weakness into a weapon. But we did, and now we were done hiding. The offensive began not with a fleet or a declaration. It began with static, a whisper on the comm bands. No code, no voice, just the sound of wind, the kind of wind you hear screaming across a dead moon. At first the Zevran ignored it, but then came the second wave. Entire signal arrays distorted. Navigation systems glitched. Wayfinding algorithms returned null vectors. Ships got lost. Patrols failed to check in. And everywhere across the map, scattered human holdouts grew bolder. On Phobos, an abandoned or silo became a launch cradle for something no one expected. Not a missile. A man. Captain Jonas Nair had been left behind during the orbital siege. Presumed dead. He spent 6 months surviving off melted ice, protein paste, and one hand-built drone. Then he launched himself into Zevran orbit, wearing a fusion patch and magnetic boots. He boarded an enemy scout frigate mid-drift. He had no armor, no backup, no comms, but he had a plan. He vented the cargo bay, used it to flush 2 Zevran through the external hatch. The third he strangled with a tow cable. Then he took control of the ship. He named it Reclamation. He flew it straight into the heart of the asteroid belt, not to escape, to teach others how he did it. Reclamation became a beacon. Within weeks, humans across the system began repurposing Zevran tech. They learned how to confuse Zevran motion sensors by flooding them with electromagnetic echoes. They used Zevran auto-targeting against their own ships by mimicking their signature pulses with jury-rigged transmitters. One by one, Zevran systems failed to recognize friend from foe. They began to fire on each other, and no one came to help them, because the humans had finally taken the one thing the Zevran had relied on from the start: certainty. On the edge of Neptune's rings, an old science station known as Icebound was reborn. It became a black site, a think tank, a fortress made from wreckage. Their scientists and engineers began analyzing everything humans had gathered: Zevran armor, weapons, data cores. They discovered the Zevran command protocol included a hardwired hierarchy node. If one ship registered as higher authority, it could override another. So they built a fake node, a virus pretending to be a Zevran supercarrier, and they broadcast it. Every ship that came within range submitted to it and received new orders: self-destruct, disarm, or jump into deep space and never return. It worked on 3 destroyers before the Zevran realized. But by then the damage was done. They stopped trusting their own ships, and that was the beginning of the end. Elias Vore heard of all this through data bursts. The tunnels of Enceladus still echoed with cold, but they were no longer filled with silence. They were filled with work, wires, maps, plans. His team now numbered 16. Former miners, techs, even a pair of ex-soldiers who had escaped a Zevran camp on Ganymede and made their way here through cryosleep and chance. They called themselves Echo 9. They built the first stealth capsule from station parts and debris. They launched it toward Titan with one mission: place a signal beacon on the Zevran communication tower and detonate a pulse bomb. It would fry their relay, cut their orders, make them deaf. The capsule hit atmosphere 2 days later. It broke apart on entry, but the core made it. They never heard back from Echo 9, but the tower went silent, and Zevran command across the outer planets began to stumble. On Earth, the last cities rose from their craters. Not tall, not glorious, just quiet and functional, covered in solar mesh, buried into rock. Survivors emerged from arc shelters and old bunkers. The last remnants of Earth Defense Corps regrouped. They linked with orbital cells, with Mars, with Ceres, with Enceladus. A network formed, not a military, something better, a movement. No flags, no leaders, just a shared truth. We endured. Now we retaliate. The Zevran command structure began to crumble. They launched purges, wiped out their own commanders they suspected of being compromised. Some Zevran ships jumped away and never returned. Others self-destructed when human signals infiltrated their internal networks. They called it contamination. We called it justice. But it was not over. They sent one final ship, a supercarrier the size of a small moon. No name, just purpose. Burn Earth. Erase everything. This was their endgame. We knew it was coming, and we were ready. In orbit we had 5 ships. Old wrecks, barely operational, but they carried a new kind of payload. Ourselves. Hundreds of volunteers, ready to crash their ships into the Zevran core. But it never came to that, because by the time the carrier entered the inner system, it began to drift. Then it tilted, and then it powered down. Not from battle, from a virus. An echo pulse launched weeks before by a rogue drone drifting near Mercury. It took time, but it found its way in. And it waited. And when the Zevran tried to power their primary weapon grid, everything shut down. They had no backups, because they had never needed them. They had never met anything like us. We launched the final blow from Earth, a single kinetic rod, tungsten alloy, no guidance, no warhead, just speed. It punched through the carrier's core like a god's hammer. The explosion lit up the sky for hours, and then there was quiet, for real this time, not the silence of fear, but the silence that comes after victory. Elias stood on the surface of Enceladus one last time before the transport arrived. He looked up. No Zevran in the sky, only stars. He smiled, and Lyra, now 10 years old and taller, held his hand. "We made it," she said. He nodded. "We did. They say war ends when the guns fall silent. For humanity, the war ended when the silence spoke for us." The Zevran were gone. Their fleets vanished. Their signals dead. No formal surrender came. No diplomats. No peace accords. They simply left. It was not retreat. It was rejection, as if the galaxy itself had grown too sharp for them to grasp. The species they thought would collapse had shown them what collapse truly meant, because humans had not only survived, we had adapted. We had taught others to fear endurance. The aftershocks rippled for decades. Across deep space in the debris rings of dead Zevran colonies, faint transmissions began to echo back. Not from us, from them. Echoes of confusion, fear, a voice repeating the same phrase in distorted translation. Too costly, too resistant, unfit for assimilation, command rejected. It became a myth among alien traders, whispers of a cursed sector, a species that feeds on loss, that grows stronger the more it is burned. They named it the Endurance Zone. Back on Earth, the cities did not rise the way they once had. No more skyscrapers scraping the sky. No more glowing spires of vanity. Humanity built low, solid, modular, shelters shaped like shields. Communities dug into earth and ice, not out of fear, but out of principle. We learned that safety was not in height, but in depth, not in the open, but in the core. We taught our children how to build from nothing, how to light a fire without fuel, how to read signals in static, how to disappear and strike from shadows. History classes included not only the wars we fought, but the techniques we used. How Captain Nair captured a ship with nothing but gravity boots and instinct. How Elias Vorn survived the cold and made traps out of vents and steel rods. How a 9-year-old girl helped carry power cells for wounded engineers through frozen tunnels while the enemy passed above. We taught them everything, and we called it the Endurance Doctrine. New ships were built, not massive cruisers, not battle fortresses, but swarm craft, stealth skippers, decoy pods, some small enough to hide inside a hollowed asteroid, some equipped with false echo chambers that made one human read as a full fleet. We did not rebuild the same civilization. We built something sharper, harder, more patient. We became a people of watchers, listeners, planners. A new network formed, not a government, a lattice, a web of nodes, each colony independent, each outpost self-reliant, but all connected by code, encrypted pulses known only to the Endurance Line, a communication structure designed to survive blackout, disruption, even total orbital collapse. The Zevran had taught us the danger of centralization. Now we were 1,000 points of light, each one capable of surviving alone, but burning brightest together. On Mars an academy opened, but not for soldiers, for survivors, students trained in deep oxygen deprivation, in thermal regulation under planetary blackouts. They fasted, learned silence, learned how to resist interrogation by relying not on strength, but on memory. They called themselves the Quiet Flame. Their motto, "We do not speak until the storm has passed, but we are always burning." And across the stars the story spread, even to species who had never met a human. There were tales of warships crippled by sandbags filled with smart dust, of space stations that went dark then reappeared 2 years later fully operational with no sign of how, of voices in the dark whispering, "We are not gone. We do not break. We endure." Some races feared us. Others sought us out. A few begged us to teach them. We did. Carefully. Because what we knew was not technology. It was mindset. It was the art of standing. When everything tells you to fall. Elias Vorn never left Enceladus. He turned down every offer. Every medal. He stayed in the tunnels. Built shelters. Planted hydroponics in the rock chambers, where frost had once ruled. He was asked once why he did not leave. His answer was simple. Because I survived here. This place is not a grave. It is proof. Lyra became a symbol. The child who endured. She never sought fame, but her name was whispered with respect. She grew up teaching children how to repair a suit with tape and courage. She told them, endurance is not a gift. It is a choice we make every second. To keep walking. To keep breathing. To never accept that we are done. 10 years after the last Zevran ship fell, a deep space beacon lit up near the Kuiper Belt, a signal never seen before. Unknown origin, unknown language, but the structure of it was familiar, layered, chaotic, almost human. Analysts decoded part of it. 2 phrases repeated. We watched. We learned. The rest was distorted. Debate began. Was it a threat? A call for help? A warning? No one knew. But humanity responded. Not with weapons. Not with ships. With a single pulse. No words. Just sound. Wind. The same wind Elias had sent from Enceladus decades before. The same signal the Resistance used to let others know. We are here. We are waiting. We are unbroken. And the stars listened. And for the first time in known galactic history, the silence answered back. With the same wind. A match. A mirror. A recognition. They too had learned. That endurance was not weakness. It was the final form of strength. If you were inspired by the endurance of humanity in this story, hit that like button to show you're one of the unbreakable. Subscribe for more stories where humans don't just survive. They adapt, overcome, and win. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if Earth was the last light in a galaxy gone dark? Because out there in the cold, it's not the strongest who survive. It's those who endure.